We do want to be sure to end before 12 so that we can all make it to the trapeza in time. So let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Seraphim Foltz, who is Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. He'll be speaking on the Gnosticism of modernity and the quest for radical autonomy.
Two worlds. Let us begin by comparing two worlds. The first is deeply rooted in an unbounded goodness and infused with a beauty that radiates from unexpected places. It is interwoven with a harmonious order that can be known and trusted. And above all, it reveals to those with purified hearts an inner graciousness that testifies to a loving creator and ruler. The soul can find a home in this world that everywhere beckons the faithful to a higher, truer, more beautiful order whose energies it reveals. The second world is dark and chaotic, a cruel prison designed by evil powers to entrap the elusive spark that lies hidden, usually unawares, within the soul. The deity itself is unimaginably remote from this baneful world that offers no hint of anything transcendent at all, unconcerned with what happens so far below in the alien realm where its kindred spirit is imprisoned. Bereft of transcendent grace, the alienated spirit must rely on its own special knowledge to escape the deranged world order into which it has been thrown, as well as the hostile soul and body that further enchain it. These are radically contrasting worlds, but in reality, they are not two different worlds at all. They are two ways of understanding the one world, our own world, the only world there is. The first is the way of Orthodox Christianity, and the second is the way of Gnosticism, perhaps the most virulent and perennial of the ancient heresies, a way that still conceals itself in subtle and often surprising forms. Part 2, the cosmology of modern Gnosticism. The philosophy of Kant, for example, might seem a most unlikely site for Gnostic teachings. But for Father Pavel Florensky, the Gnostic worldview precisely epitomizes modernity itself, as evidenced by Kant's doctrines of the autonomy of nature and the autonomy of humanity. In relation to what or whom, Florensky questions, are man and nature autonomous? Surely it is against God that their autonomy is being asserted. Kant argues that nature must obey only its own laws and indeed must conform to them if it is to be an object of human experience at all. We could not, that is, even experience an event that was not structured by the spatio-temporal matrix, which must frame our reality like the bars of an epistemological prison. An angel could not enter such a world to announce salvation, nor could a savior ascend from it. Such a world, our modern world, is even more radically severed from any epiphany of a transcendent God than the Gnostic world of the Bogomils, to whom Florensky compares the worldview of modern science, not modern science per se, the scientific worldview. No depth of meaning and no breeze of transcendence would emanate from this God-forsaken world, which presents itself only as a possible object of science. Conveniently, such a world offers no inner resistance to manipulation and control, presents no grain against which we ought not to cut. In Heidegger's words, it is a world that has become an inventory or resource, in German Bestand, for technological control and consumption, remote from God and lacking an inner logos that commands respect as a principle of meaning and order. It is entirely at our disposal to refashion as we please. For like the dark and hostile world of the earlier Gnostics, it has been fashioned by blind and random and indifferent forces, entitling and indeed obliging us to refashion it, to recreate it, to become its new creators. And since both body and soul are part of this same incoherent world, it is up to us to refashion them as well, so that they may better serve the demands of the evanescent spirit that we sense within us. No longer am I a unity of body, soul, and spirit, for my formerly God-given body is now an alien shell, which I will change and reconfigure at will, for example, by covering it with tattoos, or puncturing it with piercings, altering it through what we ironically call cosmetic surgery, or trying to change its sexual constitution through hormones enhancements or surgical invasions. For the inner spirit with which I identify is trapped in its body as an alien element. And this profound sense of alienation from my own embodiment suggests that I may be thrown into the wrong body altogether, perhaps even into the wrong species or onto the wrong planet. Hans Jonas, who has written the most important and influential work on Gnosticism in recent times, and which has not been superseded by some recent critical works, points to Pascal as prophet of this experience of the universe in modern Gnosticism. No longer is it cosmos or adornment in the ancient sense, nor is it katesis or creation in the Christian sense, for it lacks both beauty and order. It possesses only magnitude and immensity. Its signature feature is its infinity. Cast into the infinite immensity of spaces of which I am ignorant and which know me not, I am frightened, writes Pascal, a Protestant Christian. I am frightened and amazed, he continues, at finding myself here rather than there. For all is meaningless, indifferent, desacralized space, without plan or purpose. Meaning and order must be imported and imposed by humanity itself. And this nihilistic indifference of the world, Jonas argues, this eerie silence of empty spaces is even more uncanny, even more inhuman than the overt hostility that characterized the universe of ancient Gnosticism, thus the cosmology of modern Gnosticism. 3, social and political views of modern Gnosticism. But just as notable is the social and political theory of modern Gnosticism, most exhaustively studied by Jakob Taubes and Eric Voegelin. Both scholars see the decisive figure in the development, in this development of modern Gnosticism, as a 20th century Italian monk named Joachim of Flora, who contested Augustine's understanding of history as divided into 2 epochs by the incarnation of Christ. For Joachim, in contrast, there are 3 periods of history, that of the Father from Abraham to Christ, that of the Son from Christ to the 12th century, and that of the Holy Spirit, beginning with the 12th century. In this 3rd epoch, the church will become superfluous. All this will start to sound very familiar to you, I'm afraid. The church will become superfluous, for humanity will be led by the Holy Spirit, acting through a spiritual elect initially consisting of, we might have guessed, monk Joachim and his fellow Franciscans, revitalizing the ancient notion of a Gnostic elite. And here, as Voegelin explains, for the first time, the vaporous eschaton of Gnosticism, originally the mere hope of respite from the evils of this world, is projected as an imminent possibility for the existing world. As Taubes notes, the Gnostic God has previously been radically opposed to the world and utterly alien to it, just as alien had been the kindred sparks or spirits imprisoned here below, whose only hope was to navigate all the obstacles and blind alleys the archons of this world have imposed to keep it in chains. Now, with this culminating 3rd epoch, the eschaton is to be realized within this world. The Gnostic elites no longer constitute a conspiracy of individuals planning a prison break, freeing them into some Empyrean realm, but a community of the elect, divinely commissioned to bring heaven down to earth. Significantly, Joachim's views here receive opposite valuations from Taubes, who sees them as the inception of a progressive and revolutionary spirit in modernity, and from Voegelin, who famously warns us moderns not to immanentize the eschaton, a phrase some of you may have heard before. Modern-day Gnosticism robustly embraces the idea of inaugurating a 3rd New Age, making it what Voegelin calls the great heresy of modernity. It also generates a special pathology on the part of the utopians and revolutionaries who advance it, For like the ancient Gnostics, they too see the world as an alien place, created not by a beneficent God, but by hostile or indifferent forces, whether understood as evil deities, powers of nature, economic or racial groups, or social institutions. However, this lower world is no longer regarded merely as a prison house from which to take flight, but more like a poorly constructed, run-down building that needs rebuilding according to a different blueprint, that is, the eschaton revealed to the Gnostic elect. This means, however, that every element of the givenness of creation, all that is given rather than made, all that is natural, must be demolished or denied. All must be leveled to prepare for the dream world of the Gnostic visionaries. The pathology, Vogelin argues, lies not just in the Gnostic alienation from the existing world, but from the refusal to see its reality at all, a virtually psychotic non-recognition of reality, as he calls it. For openness to the real would falsify the Gnostic dream order, casting light on actions that, in Vogelin's words, in the real world would be considered morally insane. Mark Cherry just gave a litany of those. The transfigured dream world, a modern mutation of the ancient vision of a far-off realm surrounding a transcendent deity, must be further supported by a quarantine on any questioning of the Gnostic vision, for this would risk an awakening from the dream. Thereby, the dream world now displaces both the transcendent realm that once stood beyond this world, as well as worldly reality itself, whose vocabulary the dreamers appropriate, while radically changing its meaning. And Bishop Irenae spoke of that as well. Moreover, the creation of the new man requires the extermination of the old man, and therefore the murder of the God he once worshipped. The death of God becomes a central theme of the three great 19th century Gnostics, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. Along with the positing of a dream world, the prohibition of questioning, and the murder of God, a fourth element of the Gnostic vision is noted by Jonas, who shows how ancient Gnosticism rotated between an antinomian and often libertine vision of morality, and on the other hand, an extreme asceticism that condemns all earthly pleasures. And Gnostic sects since then have shown the same strange oscillation, sometimes condemning all sexuality, as with the medieval Cathars, or as Florensky points out, with the bizarre condemnation of all sex in Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, and sometimes abandoning itself to dissoluteness. Both of these, in fact, follow equally well from the Gnostic contempt for earthly norms, which can be combated either by means of extreme asceticism or through the flagrantly libertine violation of all laws that govern this accursed realm. For these laws only help imprison us. Gnosis can equally embrace, not uncommonly in concert, both the zealous English Puritans and the debauched libertine languishing in French prisons. But the path of debauchery seems to hold a special appeal. As Jonas puts it, the Gnostic can gain his freedom, and I quote, by rendering to nature its own and exhausting its powers, which bind him. St. Irenaeus, long ago, for example, reported that the Gnostic holds that he shall not get free from the powers of the dark angels that made the world until he has committed every deed there is in the world, and only when nothing is still lacking will he be released to that Gnostic deity who is above the world-creating angels. As Jonas comments, sin is the way of salvation here, the theological inversion of the idea of sin itself. Here is one of the antecedents of medieval Satanism, and again, an archetype of the Faustian myth. All this is neatly incorporated within the work of the Marquis de Sade, praised by Camus in The Rebel, where it is insisted that Sade is not an atheist, but a Gnostic, who believes in a criminal deity who oppresses and denies mankind, and against whom rebellion is imperative. The Enlightenment and its scientific worldview had already distanced themselves from God through the autonomy of nature and humanity. Politically, this had been implemented in the French Revolution and the destruction of the ancient regime. But citizen Sade believed that this liberation was inadequate, for the idea of a creator God still lingered, if only in the imagination. Humanity must be freed from the creator it has rejected by demolishing the very thought of God through revolutionary practice, which Sade saw as requiring not mere unbelief, but a passion for sacrilege, active blasphemy that would be profoundly offensive to the very idea of a creator, while declaring war upon God's creation and all that is natural within it, seeking to destroy what serves nature and to insult it in all its works. Significantly, he saw the most effective means of rebellion against the creator of this maleficent world as the blasphemous violation of every conceivable sexual prohibition, whether written or unwritten. Hence, those who dare to engage in and celebrate the most monstrous acts of sexual depravity, involving a panoply of unnatural horrors ranging from scatological indecency to the violation of all bonds of kinship and friendship to the outright murder of the sexual victim, become the modern Gnostics' advance guard, the heroic shock troops inaugurating the reign of the new man. Above all, sex must be radically severed from its source and fertility, which enchains us to nature and strengthens our bondage to this world. Part 4, modern Gnosticism and the autonomous individual. But what of the individual who has embraced, however tacitly, this worldview of modern Gnosticism? An answer must begin with the radical character of the Cartesian cogito as entailing an ontological shift, a dislocation of our very sense of being from that of substance to that of subject. For the precise formula and its logic is not cogito ergo sum, I am conscious that therefore I am, but rather cogito sum, I am conscious, I am. Within the consciousness of my own consciousness, and through this alone I am. For I am never merely conscious, but always simultaneously conscious of my own consciousness. Thus, consciousness turns back upon itself by being aware of itself, thereby generating itself in the very act of self-consciousness. True consciousness is thus self-consciousness, producing itself through its very exercise. It creates itself, becomes its own foundation. Descartes thus recapitulates in philosophy the theological rebellion of his contemporary Luther, founding the modern worldview upon subjectivity. We are no longer in the world, rather the world is in our experience of it. Perhaps even more radically, he reverses Exodus 3. The I am is not spoken, not given by the Creator, but accomplished by the creature, who by that fact becomes the new creator, the self-creator, the new fundamentum inconcusum, or unshakable foundation, upon which all else is predicated, for whom all else is now an object. And in this act of self-creation, consciousness asserts itself as radically free from the world external to it. Even as Descartes Gnostically speculates, it has become, even if it's been created by an evil demon. But alas, there are problems here. Hegel's celebrated master-slave dialectic shows that it is recognition by another self that allows self-consciousness to proceed beyond the empty, abstract formula of I equals I, actualizing itself in the world. This problem is further demonstrated in Sartre's dilemma of the for itself and the in itself, where consciousness requires recognition by another consciousness, who meanwhile always threatens to objectify it, frees it into an object that exists not for itself, but for another. Radically free subjectivity, existing primarily through its own creation of itself, At the same time needs recognition by another self-consciousness to be more than an empty movement of pure reflexivity. That is, in order to have content, to be something. But when it is recognized as that something, it must immediately rebel against that objectification, and back and forth and on and on. For Sartre, this is the unsolvable tragedy of the human condition. But in fact, it is simply the agonized dilemma generated by the Gnostic self-creation of the autonomous individual in modernity. It is also the anguish of identity politics. To ensure autonomy from an oppressive world of iniquitous origin, the individual must be self-defined, and indeed self-created, to be free from the contamination of all that is merely given. If I'm born into a certain social class, religious group, or above all sexual identity, I must redefine, recreate myself in a way that conforms not to this lower world fashioned by nefarious powers, and it matters little whether or not these are seen as dark angels, social institutions, or sinister groups, but rather corresponds to the truer, higher world that the spiritual spark within me intuits. And there must be unlimited options open for this project of self-creation. Not just two sexes or two sexual orientations, for example, but dozens, scores, hundreds that will allow for the discernment and realization of my true identity. Moreover, I must assume this new self-created identity not just as something subsisting for my own eyes alone, but as something recognized by others. And not just by a few others, but as acknowledged by all others, who universally owe me this recognition. Why the importance of sexuality in particular? For Sartre, it is because here I can behold the impossible dream of being both pure subject for myself and pure object for another, lulling me into the deluded dream that I can be both at the same time. The Gnostic quest for radical autonomy ends in a nightmarish oscillation between the exhilaration of liberation and the claustrophobia of objectification. Part 5, and this is the conclusion. Two paths. But this same dialectic was accurately diagnosed some 2 centuries ago by the Danish philosopher and theologian Søren Kierkegaard. In The Sickness Unto Death, he maps the rotations and gyrations of the self that is trying to generate itself, trying to grasp itself in relation to others, trying to save itself. And he terms this agonizing exercise through which self-consciousness twists and turns in order to be itself on its own terms, despair, or more traditionally, as he notes, sin. Here, however, with the Christian Kierkegaard, in contrast to the figures just mentioned, there's a prescription for the ailment of despair. The formula for the state in which there is no despair at all, he explains, is that state within which, in relating to itself, as he puts it, and in willing to be itself, the self rests transparently in the power that establishes it. But there is more, for he immediately adds, this formula in turn, has been frequently pointed out, is a definition of faith. More recently, both diagnosis and prescription have been eloquently stated by Jeronda Dionysius of Petra. And I quote, when Satan, who was the first and highest angel, looked away from God and turned his attention to himself, there we had the first seed of an ego. He took his spiritual eyes away from the view of the Holy Trinity, the view of the Lord, and he looked at himself and started to think about himself. That moment started the history, the reality, and the existence of the ego, which is not reality, but the refusal of reality. Ego is the flower that comes out from the death of love. When we kill love, the result is ego. Or as Christos Giannaros has written, following the patristic emphasis on eros that culminates with St. Maximus, and that reveals both why our salvation depends upon properly directed eros and why the Gnostic misdirection of sexuality is so toxic, quoting Giannaros, the way of life as Christians encounter it in the person of Christ is the way of eros. It is to empty oneself of any demand for individual self-existence, to draw existence and life not from our individual nature, but from a free personal relationship. not to claim anything, but to share everything in a frenzy of self-giving born of love. Love, the interpenetration of life that comes from Eros, is the mode of existence of God, the way that persons are made immortal, the way of true life. Thus, not only are there two ways of viewing the world, there are also two paths within the world. On the one hand, the path of faith and life and love, and on the other hand, the path of hubristic world creation, desperate self-creation, and libido dominando, or will to power. That is, there are the paths of Orthodox Christianity and that of its heretical Gnostic distortion that has now become foundational for modernity itself. Thank you.